We've made it to week 4 of the Quiltalong, and this week we are going to be putting our blocks together. I like to attach my half square triangles to my accent strips before I even decide which fabrics are going to go with which squares. So I have them laid out here. Your small accent strip is going to go on the top, and you want to make sure your half square triangle is facing the correct direction. So I like to lay out all of my pieces first, and then I will start sewing things together because I don't have to pick out any stitches. I have one of my blocks for my rainbow quilt here, and so this is what my accent fabric looks like for this block. I have not decided which fabric I'm going to use for the square, but I'll test out to make sure that it looks right. So that's an example of what I may or may not use those exact fabrics. Let me give you a couple of tips when sewing these. I have found that if the point of a half square triangle goes through your sewing machine first, then you're more likely to get good points for your half square triangle. So for this one, normally I like to sew with the smaller piece on top, but if I sew it this way, when it goes through my machine, the point goes through last, and I want it to go through first. So I'm actually going to flip it over. I'm going to pin. You don't have to do it this way, but I do think that it makes a difference for me. So you decide what works for you. So I've just got that underneath, and I've got my pins in. And then for this one, when I put them right sides together, having the smaller piece on top, the point of the half square triangle does go through first. So I'm going to pin that into place. All right, now I have my half square triangles attached to my strips of accent fabric. I'm going to set those out, and I'm going to audition some different options for the feature fabrics where to go with them. And I'll kind of walk you through my thought process while I'm looking at these. Okay, I've got all my pink squares for my rainbow quilt, and I'm going to see how they look. I'm not necessarily focused on having a lighter print or a darker print here or here. My focus here is just going to be making sure that I can differentiate really well between these two fabrics. So I want to have maybe, like, if I have a larger scale print, have a smaller scale print, lighter or darker, just something that makes it visually look very different so that they don't blend together. So this would be a good option. I may use that. This is a little bit closer in value. That's really close in value. See, there's not much of a difference between those two. All right, I think that first one was the charm. This one would be okay too, but I think I like that one the best. So I'm going to go with that one. And when I start piecing all of my blocks together, I will probably make this decision for every block before I start sewing things, so that I don't end up with some blocks that look really good and some blocks that don't look that great together. I'd rather have everything overall look mostly good, if that makes sense. All right, this is one of my darkest valued accent fabrics that I have for this quilt. I have some black ones and some dark purple ones as well. So I want to make sure that I'm using a fabric that might be harder to match with something else. I like that. Let's see. I don't want to use the same print. I want to use something different. Let's see. I don't want to go dark and dark. I could use tons of these light prints would work, but I want to save those for maybe lighter accent fabrics. Use something like this. It's pretty different in value, but it's going to be closer in shade than a lot of my other combinations. So I'm going to try to keep it more different. This is a lighter blue, so I think maybe that works better. All right, I think I'm going to do that. I'm going to start by sewing this top piece onto the feature fabric square. Same thing. I want the point of the half square triangle to go through the machine first. So I'm going to pin at the beginning. I'm going to pin at the end. And then I'm going to pin in between. I always like to sew if there is a seam. It just helps it stay open or stay pressed to the side or whatever way you've pressed your fabric. I've sewn these together and pressed them. So they look like this now. Now I'm going to attach this last side, and I'm going to sew that so that this part goes through the machine first. Now the reason why that this can be helpful is, let's say that you line these up together and you find that they're not exactly the same size, which can happen to anybody. If it's happening consistently, you'll want to look at your seam allowance to make sure you're a scant 1/4 inch, or try to be more accurate with your cutting, because they should be exactly the same size. But if they aren't, when you have this part go through the machine first, you're prioritizing matching up the half square triangle part rather than these square ends right here. And it will be less noticeable if things don't match down here than over here, if that makes sense. Now, ideally, everything would just be the same size. So if you're perfect and never make any mistakes, that's wonderful. I'm very happy for you. I'm going to do the first. I'm going to pin the last. I'm going to pin in the middle. Then I'm going to pin at each place where there's a seam open. Now, I press my seams open, and what I like to do is pin them open so that it doesn't get folded over when it goes through the machine. And I'll do it even if that seam is on top. So I'm going to pin it open. It just helps everything stay nice and flat. Okay, now I'm going to do this one. All right, and here are my finished blocks. Now, these are scrap. This is a scrap. These are both scrap quilts. I am not even a little bit concerned about my fabric's direction. So if you want to be concerned about that, that's great. I just, it does not bother me, especially with the scrap quilt. All right, these, when they're done, should measure 6.5 inches squared. So if they don't, you should definitely check out your seam allowance, because they should be exactly 6.5 inches square. You want to make sure you have a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance when you sew these together, and I will do a video about how to do that and why that is important as well. So make sure you check that out if you're having issues with your blocks not being the right size. So I'm going to make a whole bunch more of these now.